the tabernacle, the portable, so to speak, Beit HaMikdash, really a portable temple, the temporary dwelling place of Hashem. And while we can talk a lot about the big ideas behind the Mishkan, behind the tabernacle, what I would like us to do this week is actually look at the text and look at the language and look at the details, the concept of a Mishkan, the concept of a tabernacle, the fact that there is a place in this world, both where Hashem resided when the Jews were in the desert, as well as when they first came to the land of Israel, that even predates the idea of a permanent home for Hashem, is one that we could talk about for so long. And the idea, the pasuk itself, which expresses this idea so beautifully in pasuk Chet, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, the idea that God instructs us to build for him a mikdash, a place, a holy place, a place that is designated specifically for him, and then he will dwell among us. It's written in command form, obviously, but we are taking this as though it applies to us still today. And of course, there is lots to say about the jobs that we all have in modern times of creating spaces for Hashem in our lives. And when we do so, we invite him in, and as he says in this pasuk, he will join us. So there's so much to talk about, but I actually wanted to focus a little bit more on the nuts and bolts, so to speak, of the Mishkan, because as what usually happens when we take off our the glasses we've been wearing when we've been reading the Parsha for so many years, and you look at it with fresh eyes, you very often come up with ideas or insights, or even you just notice things that have always been there. The text, as we know, has not changed. And yet sometimes, depending on what's going on, we tend to, certain things tend to jump out at us in the text. So I wanted to just take a few moments and point out sort of the structure of the Parsha, and then focus on two specific things in this week's Parsha. So the first is just to go through the details of what gets discussed. So the Hashem in this Parsha commands the Jewish people through Moshe, obviously, that they are not just to construct the Mishkan, but it's super specific in how the Mishkan should be constructed, as well as what is to go inside the Mishkan. So it starts by describing the Aron, the Ark, the Holy Ark, and exactly how it is to be constructed. We're going to come back and talk about that in a bit more detail. And then the Shulchan, the table, where the showbreads, the Lechem Hapanim, were going to be displayed, the menorah, right, which is the thing I think that we have the easiest connection to, because it's something that we've sort of taken with us into that 1 week a year where we light our very own menorahs, Chanukiahs. The construction of the Mishkan itself is talked about, and specifically I'm referring to the boards and the curtains. So specifically the linens, the curtains, I don't know what else to call them. Is there another, for a yiriah, I'm blanking on the drapery is almost, I think, what comes to mind. Very, very massive pieces of fabric that are going to be, they're going to be sewn, and they're going to be embroidered, and they're going to be attached to each other and draped across the Mishkan. Really quite intricate in its detail, along with the measurements for everything as we go through. And then the Torah discusses the boards, the planks of wood, and what they need to be made of, and their exact specific measurements, as well as the sockets and the rings, and literally every Home Depot-esque type of detail that you could imagine is essentially listed in this week's Parsha that will allow for it to be constructed and then deconstructed when it's time for it to be moved. Included in this Parsha is also the paroches, the screen. I'll call it a screen, it functioned like a screen. The separation, the linen that was, or the drapery that was a separation between the regular part of the Mishkan and the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodashim, and how that was to be made, followed by an actual screen that was at the entrance to the Mishkan. And it is, if you would like to hear more about this, I found my husband's shir on YU Torah that I think he must have given like yesterday or the day before when he gives the Parsha shir. He went through in not full detail, but much detail, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, whom he's been studying in all of his classes this year, all of his Parsha-based classes. And Rav Hirsch is not alone, goes through each and every material that is used in the Mishkan and what its symbolism is, what it stands for, what it represents. And of course, this is not a surprise, not that Rav Hirsch would pick up on it, but more so, not that the Torah would would not take advantage of an opportunity to teach a lesson through every single material that we are commanded to contribute to the building of the Mishkan, and it was actually used in its construction. So whether it's the metals, it's funny because if I'm not mistaken, I think the Olympics start this week. And so, of course, I had in my mind, gold, silver, bronze, because those are the metals that we're all talking about now, or we will be talking about. So in this week's Parsha, we talk a lot about gold, silver, and copper. That's like pretty close. And the symbolism behind the metals, the symbolism behind the wood, behind each and every fabric, material, what each one is made out of, how it's woven. In tremendous detail, Refresh goes through, as do other commentaries. And so if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look up this year and check it out. For our purposes, I would like to just focus today on two things, as I mentioned. Number one, the Aron itself. So the Aron is known as the Aron HaEdut, the Ark of Testimony, which refers to the fact that inside the Ark, we kept the luchot, both the original, the shattered pair, as well as the new pair. And it was a testimony. It was the site of the holiest part of the Mishkan and eventually of the Beit HaMikdash. It was in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the only thing in the Kodesh HaKodashim. And on top of it were the Kruvim, right? The famous cherubs, the childlike looking, almost idols that were on top of the Aron, that we're told in the Midrashim, faced each other at certain times when the Jewish people were being loving towards each other and turned away from each other when the Jewish people were not being so good to each other, unfortunately. And specifically in this parsha, when it describes the Aron, we're given the measurements and we're given all of the details. One of the things we're also told is that it's from this place that Hashem would communicate with the Jewish people, that the voice of Hashem would come out from on top of the Aron, in between these two kruvim, in between these two angelic figures, we'll call them. And that is how Hashem would communicate through the Jewish people. So it's no surprise that the Aron represents Torah study, represents relationship and connection. It's not lost on any of the Mefarshim, nor is it lost on us, that the very same item, the very same vessel in the Mishkan that represents the Torah and Torah study is also wrapped up in it are the kruvim. They're attached to each other, one on top of the other, where there's a reflection of the relationship between the Jewish people, right? That we can never separate what it means to be studying Torah and treating our fellow human being, right? That those two things are inextricably linked. You can't be a Torah scholar without having proper interactions, proper character. The way we treat our fellow people is really the greatest testimony to whether the Torah has penetrated, right? Whether the Torah we've been learning has actually made us into the ideal person. So a couple of interesting things about the Aron that I think are worth mentioning. And we could do this with every single part of the Mishkan, but I chose the Aron because it's first. So the Aron famously was essentially, Chazal tell us, it was three boxes, three separate boxes. I kind of picture it like those dolls, those Russian dolls whose names I'm forgetting, where like the little one and then the next one, the next one, the next one. So kind of like that they three boxes that inserted into each other. The dimensions were just right, that they fit snugly inside of each other. The outermost one was gold. The middle one was made of atzei shittim, made of the wood, the same wood that was used in all of the Mishkan. And then the inside one was gold again. And of course, there's so much symbolism here. The idea that, there's gold on the outside that is seen to the world, and gold outside and inside, and in between is the wood, representing the fact that one explanation is that gold, which is beautiful to look at, it's shiny, it catches your eye, but a metal is not considered a living thing. Right? It is a natural substance, right? Metals are a natural substance, like a rock, like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi would describe, right? But it's a domain. It's like nothing, it has no life to it whatsoever. There's no growth, there's no change, as opposed to the wood, which represents the next level above, let's say, a rock or a piece of metal, would be a tzomeach, something that grows. Now, a tree, or the wood that's represented by this box inside the Aron, is certainly not at the level of an animal, and certainly not that of a human being, which sort of top off the highest levels of creation. But it is one level above. And the idea that at the innermost part of a person's Torah study, which the Aron represents, is this ability to change, right? Metal, unless it's hammered out or someone does something to it, it cannot change. But wood, I guess it's not so true once it's been chopped, but maybe it is. And that's why, it would rot if it's not treated. So wood inherently was something that was not living and breathing the way a human being or an animal, but just by its very nature is something that is organic. It can change, right? And it is something that can change for the better or for the worse. And at its core, that's really, that's one of the things that the Aron represents. A couple of other ideas about the Aron. It had rings, as did all of the other kelim in the Beis Hamikdash, all of the other vessels, for practical purposes. The rings on the outside were what allowed the poles to slide through, and then the people would carry the Levium, would then carry the kelim, carry the vessels as they traveled throughout the desert. What was different about the Aron is that the poles stayed in the rings all the time. So whereas the shulchan, the table, which was also going to be carried by people, it wasn't taken apart and reassembled each time. It was, my understanding is, it was transported exactly the way that it was. The rings were always there. They were permanent, but the poles, you would only put the poles in when you were ready to move it. Otherwise, the poles went in the storage area. But the Aron was unusual in that the poles were always inside the rings. And this is famously illustrated by the Medrash and the idea that the poles themselves, and it's really beautiful imagery. You see like how Chazal were so attuned to the human mind and how when they wanted to give a message across, they're not afraid to use certain imagery that might be considered like, oh, I can't believe they said that. The image that Chazal give us are that when a person were to look at the parochas, if they were to look at the drapery that was separating the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKodashim, the regular part of the Mishkan and the holiest part of the Mishkan, is that there were two protrusions coming out of the parochet that looked like a woman's breasts, like under a dress or under a shirt. And Chazal used this to help us understand, and it's like such a really graphic image, but they're using that to help us understand that the very nourishment, right? The nutrition, the sustenance that the Jewish people needed, right? This image of a mother's breasts, which are what give life to her child, that was represented by the poles in the Kodesh HaKodashim and how they like just a little bit poked through the paroches. Something else that I saw that I think is really just an accurate and insightful thing for all of us to try to keep in mind, is that there's a law that's dictated by the Rambam, by Maimonides, that the Aron, more than any other kli, more than any other vessel in the Mishkan, had to be carried by people. So whereas there were poles that allowed the Levium to carry the table, the shulchan, if it turned out that nobody was available to carry the shulchan that day, all the Levium had taken a day off, if you needed to, you could put it on top of a wagon, you could, send it in a way that, just was more functional for whatever reason on that particular day. But the Aron was different. The Aron was only allowed to be held by people. And the poles, the suggestion is the poles were there as a reminder, don't ever take the shortcut and throw the Aron on a wagon or do something else with it. It is essential that the Aron is always carried by people. And there's a famous story in Navi, in Sefer Shmuel, where David HaMelech makes a grave error that costs people their lives, where in his excitement to bring the Aron back, right, he puts it on an agalai, puts it on a wagon. The story of Uzzah and how there is tremendous price, unfortunately, to be paid for that mistake. So it just drives home this point that the Aron always has to be held by people, and specifically has to be held by pairs of people, so that the two people carrying the Aron, well, it's more than two, probably four, carrying the Aron on each corner, they had to be facing each other. So their backs were always outside and the people were always facing each other who carried the Aron, which to me is such beautiful. If you could picture the human being standing under the Aron itself, it's on their shoulders. And then above that are the Kruvim, who were also hopefully in a state of facing each other. And that in order, it just is really a beautiful way to drive home the point, in order for the Aron to be carried, in order for the Jewish people to carry the Torah, right, in order for them to be true students of the Torah, they have to be working together. And they have to be facing each other, right? There has to be a mutual respect, a mutual acknowledgement, just recognition of the other. And that's how they walked. They didn't walk facing forwards, which which you would think would make more sense. They essentially walked with their bodies facing towards each other, and I guess managed to move forward somehow. And that is just a great reminder in our study of Torah that what really often matters, of course, we have a mitzvah to study the Torah and to internalize it, but part of that process always has to be our connection with our fellow human beings. And in fact, I saw in an article, I'm going to look up the person's name. I was reading an article from Michal Horowitz, she often quotes really amazing sources that I wouldn't have found on Sefaria on my own. So she quoted a Ramosha Feinstein who suggests that the reason why those poles always had to be there is not because so that you don't make the mistake and accidentally put it on the wagon, but he takes it a step further. And what she quotes Ramosha as saying is that it needs to be that the Aron, which arguably we could say is like the highest level of Torah study. So if we could picture our Torah scholars, our Torah leaders, that they always need to recognize that that's who they are. There's never a time or a place where they can relax those standards. Not to say that they, because we all make fun of my husband and, and other rabbinic figures, maybe that they can't relax that, they loosen the tie a little bit. That's what it's talking about is Torah leaders, right? Scholars, the people that we all look up to and recognize as our, the people who are guiding us, big communal leaders, national leaders, and how their behavior always needs to be consistent. The poles are always there and they're ready to go. Meaning, an example Rav Moshe gives is that a person always, if they're studying the Torah, it doesn't give them an excuse to belittle the Torah study of another. He tells a very cute story about a Rav who was told that when he goes to his local shul, like he was a big Talmid Chacham, when he goes to the local shul, he should not take out a sefer and begin to learn on his own. He should actually stay and listen to the learning amongst the people in the congregation, because he has so much to learn from the people around them. And that's by definition what it means to be a Talmid Chacham. Right? We call our greatest Torah scholars Talmidim. We call them students, because there's inherently a humility to recognizing how much a person does not know. Just because they know doesn't mean that there's not more. There's by definition so much more than they should. Behavior should always be consistent. So that's just a couple of ideas about the Mishkan. I'll share one other one, and I think this one is my favorite. And that is when you look at the measurements of all the different kelim in the Mishkan. So I think, did I lose you all? In.
Can't hear you.
Can someone tell me if I'm unfrozen?
You're
No.
talk. I think you're still frozen.
Yeah. I thought you were.
So sorry about that. I apologize. I don't know. My internet connection went down. So I instead am logging on using my hotspot from my phone. Forgive me. Let's just get back to finishing up the Mishkan, the Aron. So one of the things that you notice when you look at the measurements that are given, very specific measurements, all in amot, given for each vessel. So one of the things you notice is that it is only the Aron that is measured in amot and halves. None of the measurements are complete. They all have a 0.5 at the end, whereas the other measurements of the other kelim, including the boards and everything else, they are either fully complete, like 20 by 4, or they might be 4.5 by 20. But the Aron is the only one where every measurement that's given is all 0.5. And Chazal, of course, nothing is lost on them. They don't let something like this go by. And so they point out that inherent in Torah study, which, as we said, that's what the Aron represents, inherent in Torah study is the fact that it cannot happen alone, that a person, by definition, has to recognize that alone they cannot grow to their fullest potential. It actually reminds me, I was listening recently, I've quoted this podcast to some of you before, Meaningful People. And they do interview some very interesting and meaningful people. So I was listening to one recently where they were interviewing someone named Nissim Black. Nissim Black is a very popular rapper who is also now a Breslover and lives in Israel with his family. He is African-American. He grew up in Seattle in essentially I don't even know how to describe. He talks about it, because it's his life and he's so familiar with it. But you listen to how he grew up as a child with two parents who were drug addicts and drug traffickers, and what he saw, what he experienced. It's really quite, it's disheartening to know that this is how someone in the world could be growing up today in the United States of America. And yet you see what he's made of his life, and it's really quite astonishing. He's such an impressive person. One of the things he talks about is his search. He grew up not particularly any religion. He had an uncle who was Muslim, and so he followed him for a while. And then he found Messianic Judaism, and he followed that for a while. But it was always he would read and read and read. He was a voracious reader, and he would read and read. And then he would get to a point where he realized he needed to interact with the community or the people. So he would go to the mosque, or he would go to the Messianic temple. And then from talking to the people, he realized oh, no, this isn't it. And he finally keeps reading. He talks about how he would stay up all night. His wife thought he had really lost his mind. They went through this process together. It's quite fascinating. And he talks about he would stay up till 3, 4 in the morning until his brain was literally ready to explode, reading Navi and reading different Sfarim online, whatever he could get his hands on in English, because he didn't know Hebrew at the time. He had started a little bit. He wasn't comfortable reading yet in Hebrew. And he talks about how it wasn't until he left his computer and his books and actually went to the shul and found a beis medrash and started talking to people that he finally understood. He had so much information, but until he came face to face with another human being and talked things through, he was lacking all perspective. He didn't really have a full understanding. And that's really what the message that Chazal are giving us from the Aron, that a person cannot be an island. We know this to be true. But when it comes to Torah study in particular, we know this is true about character refinement. It's really a lot easier to be a super nice, evolved, self-actualized human being if you don't interact with people. It's a lot easier. But the goal is, in order to reach your potential and reach our potential, is it requires interaction. And so the same is true for Torah study. And by definition, this has to happen with other people in order that we will broaden our perspectives, that it's not just about figuring out this is what's meaningful to me. It's also about understanding what's meaningful to the other person and how do they connect and what can I learn from their insight? What can I learn from their experience? We know Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 faces to the Torah, but it's not just enough to say I'm one of 70 and the other 69 people should live and be well. It's that we should all be interacting with each other so that we learn the character traits of respect. And as we talked about, the people facing each other, carrying the Aron, not just of respect, but acknowledgement. And again, the idea of broadening perspective, which happens through this process. That's one of the messages of the Aron. Okay, putting that aside, in the time that we have left, and because Susan's always the advocate for sticking on just a little bit after 1:00, we'll probably go a little bit over, but nobody feel bad if you have to leave. I want to go through the language in Parak Chavav. This is the language that describes, I'm going to find, Chafei is longer than I remembered. Okay, we are going to look at the language in Parak Chavav. There is a phrase that repeats itself 3 times in the Parak. And while I know that on a Pshat level, just on a surface translation level, it's just not a big deal. This is just how the Torah speaks. There is something about it that grabbed my attention. And I hope you'll also find it kind of meaningful. In describing the Yiriot, the cloth that is going to cover the Mishkan had essentially 3 layers of covering. So in describing those, this is the initial layer. There were 10 Yiriot. There were 10 pieces of fabric. And it talks about they all had to be the exact same measurement. And then it tells us that they were split 5 and 5, and they needed to be connected to each other. And the psukim describe here in Pasuk Gimel, right? Chamesh hayiriot tihiena, 5 of them, chovrot isha el achota, that each one has to be joined to her sister. That's literally how it translates. Each one should be choveret, or they should be chovrot to her sister. V'chamesh yiriot chovrot isha el achota, right? So like on the 5 had to be connected to each other. And I just found this to be such an unusual language. It turns out it's not so unusual. This is how, Tanakh expresses itself. And in fact, Rashi points out, when the Torah is describing something that is zachar, that is masculine, it'll say ish al chavero, a man and his brother. If it's describing something that is nekeva, that is feminine in nature, like in our case, a yiri'ah, right, is nekeva. So it will describe it as a woman and her sister, if it wants to describe one and the other. So I know that Rashi is just sort of giving us a very literal explanation, like it's just letting us know that this is what the Torah means when it says, a woman and her connected to her sister. But I couldn't help, as a woman, reading these psukim and feeling like, oh my gosh, the Torah is using a certain type of imagery in order to illustrate a very technical, practical point, that the 5 curtains had to be aligned. We'll see the language of aligned in a moment, connected to the other 5 curtains. And then it tells us a few psukim later, or in the next pasuk, it tells us that there needed to be loops made out of techelet, 50 altogether, that were going to be the things that connected the curtains. And then it says each one is going to be connected to the other. Again, at the end of Pasuk K, makbilot halulaot isha el achota, right? Again, each one, and you see here the language in English. One, it's chovrot isha el achota, joined one to the other in Pasuk Gimel. And then in Pasuk K, it tells us makbilot halulaot isha el achota. They have to be makbil is like parallel, right? So they have to be equal or set up opposite one another exactly. And then again in Pasuk Vav tells us the same thing. Attached to those 50 loops of techelet were gold clasps that connected the two, the sets of loops were connected by gold clasps. Again, isha el achota, a woman to her sister. And what did this allow for? V'haya hamishkan echad. When this took place, then the Mishkan would be considered whole. And I searched and searched. Sefaria didn't have necessarily, I found one thing that I want to share with you, but I was looking, for someone who would be jumping up and down and saying with exclamation points, like, do you see what this is saying? We have all these other sources that tell us that the Jewish people had to be unified in order for them to receive the Torah, right? The famous psukim leading up to Matan Torah, right? That vayisu, vayachanu, everything written in plural. And then vayichan sham Yisrael neged hahar. And then as one, they were encamped opposite the mountain or around the mountain. And of course, the famous Rashi, which is quoting the famous Midrash that says, right? Ki ish achad b'lev achad, when the Jewish people are unified like one human being, that's when Hashem said, now they're ready to have the Torah, that the unity among people is a prerequisite for receiving the Torah. And here, I think perhaps one of the, granted, this is not pshat, this is not the literal meaning of the psukim. The literal meaning of the psukim is, practically speaking, you need to make sure that things are lined up so it's aesthetically pleasing. And what we're going to see in a moment, actually, let me show that to you first, is the He'imek Davar that says the following. Let me just find it for you. The He'imek Davar points out that and I'm sorry, I don't have this in English, that the purpose of making sure that things are so lined up. And what he points out is that the beams, the krashim of the Mishkan also had to be lined up perfectly. Of course they did. Otherwise they wouldn't have fit in the sockets properly, right? The adanim, everything had to be lined up, right? If you're building a structure, you better make sure that everything is lined up and things fit inside each other. But that there was an additional purpose, or maybe this is really the purpose of the curtains being lined up. What he points out is, what the psukim had told us, is that when these pieces of fabric are woven together, they also were not just beautiful to look at, but they created an image. They created a picture. And that picture was that of the kruvim, right? So those very same kruvim that we talked about before, that were on top of the aron, and that represent the Jewish people's love for each other and their idyllic state of respecting each other and coming close to each other, and how that is really the goal of the Torah itself that's underneath them, that image of the kruvim was actually illustrated on all the different panels. And therefore, it's not just a mitzvah to follow the directions in the Torah, which were that everything had to be, attached to the poles properly and hung neatly, and everything had to look just so. But there was this, really what's underlying this, the purpose of this is, in order for the image of the kruvim to be perfect and complete, it's not that the image was on one panel. It was made up of all of the different panels. And so they had to be aligned just so in order for the image to come across in its perfect state. And the language that he uses here, right, that they had to be chovrot achat el achat. And then he says, here, right? So they had to be aligned, perfectly aligned. Because imagine how funny it would look if you're trying to create a beautiful image that, if one is like jutting out a little bit, or one is pulled back a little bit, or if there's a bit of an overlap, so then you lose that perfect, the perfect overall vision of the kruvim themselves. And it was hard for me to read this, to hear what the Ha'amek Davar was saying, and read these psukim and see this language, and not think that there's another message here for us, for women who are sitting here studying Torah together on a Thursday afternoon. And that is that the idea that the Jewish people, Jewish women in particular, have an opportunity, I don't want to call it an obligation, but I think we could maybe call it an obligation, to connect with each other. And that the only way for, as the Parsha is telling us, the only way for the Mishkan to be echad, the only way for the Mishkan itself to be complete, and the only way for the image of the kruvim, which represents the unity of the entire Jewish people, the only way for that to happen is for one woman to be connected to her sister, right? Not everyone is blessed in their life to have a sister or to have had a sister, but I think we understand what that represents. The idea that two people, if we look at the sisters that we have in Tanakh, we look at Rachel and Leah, right? So we see like what one wouldn't do for the other, literally nothing. They would give their lives for each other, and did give their lives in a number of ways for each other. That sense of like such deep connection, such total alignment, that when we keep that in mind, so it's not just that like, oh, I'm being nice and I'm reaching out to a friend. Sometimes we have to think practically speaking. We have to look out for each other. We have to check in on each other, and we have to learn Torah together, and all of those things on a practical level for sure. But sometimes when it's not so easy to do those things, and it's more challenging because we are feeling depleted, we are feeling exhausted, we're feeling disconnected, that sometimes maybe it helps to have a reminder that it's not just about these individual interactions, that these individual interactions are actually the process of building something so much greater than what you and I represent, right? It's the fact that our Torah study, our reaching out to each other, our being aligned together, our putting ourselves one against the other, one, I shouldn't say against, but lined up one with the other, chovrot echat el hasheni, echat el chaverta, that the lining up, the joining together of women is something that allows the Mishkan to be whole and the image of the kruvim to be complete. And so I found this was like a good push, because in the winter months, and for the last, it's almost 2 years really, there has just been, I think, an inherent heaviness and a challenge. And it's just much harder to reach out. It's much harder to feel connected to people. And here, I think because this is what I'm feeling, this is what I read in the Parsha, that the Torah is giving us a little bit of encouragement, maybe a lot of encouragement, to recognize that it's not just about the individual interactions, but here we have an opportunity when we connect with other women in particular. We know all of Klal Yisrael is important, but here we're a bunch of women studying together, so we're going to focus on the women, and that's what the Parsha is directing us to do. Isha al chaverta, just a real, a little push and a little nudge in the right direction to think big picture sometimes, because sometimes that's what we need. Sometimes we need small, and we need to think about the practical things we could do. We can break it down into smaller components. And every once in a while, it's helpful to recognize that we're part of a much bigger endeavor, a much bigger enterprise. And that is that of building the Jewish people, of building a Mishkan. And I thought that was just something interesting that sort of came out of the language, the not unusual language, but the language that I noticed was written in a way that really speaks to me, and I hope it speaks to you as well. So with that, I wish you all a very beautiful Shabbos, an uplifting Parshat Trumah. That's really what the word Trumah, that's what it means, leharim, to raise up. And so God willing, this week's Parsha, the Torah reading, and the week in general should be one that is uplifting for all of us. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again to the Shandorfs for sponsoring the shir today. And again, it should be an aliyah for Susan's father's neshama. Thank you all. Have a great, great week. Or Shabbos.
Thank
Thank you. Welcome back.
you.
Thank you.
Rifki.
Welcome back.